Hello, everybody. I hope this works. Oh, you can see my wonderfully messy bed in the background. Cool. Anyway, the my internet's very slow all of a sudden. I don't know if it's related to the super windy weather or what. Anyway, I shall proceed. Um, So I had gotten back to the Sausolito houseboats, but as often, I would like to backtrack a bit back to the village of Rancho in Belize when I'm 15. Um, I, I believe I said something to the effect of that the right wing evangelicals there from the mostly from the USA um, did not really penetrate the consciousness of the people they were proselytizing, like their conversions were superficial. But that's not entirely true in all cases. There were some people who took it pretty seriously. Um, I remember saying to somebody there something to this. Somehow the topic of weed, marijuana came up, and I said, it's great stuff, which I believed at that time. And she said something to the effect of, "Oh, it'll make people ignore God. It'll make people forget God." Um, and then I remember somebody had a copy of the autobiography of Jim Baker. Yes, Jim Baker, the well-known televangelist who later got involved in financial scandals and sex scandals and what have you. And anyway, I started reading it. The woman who the book, she said, "Oh, you're going to read about somebody's wonderful service for God and so forth." I read it, and the only part I really that stands out in my mind, well, the best part that stands out in my mind was when he described how when he first met Tammy and then got to know her, and then at one point he said their lips melted together. Um, it's kind of an erotic, I guess, but also some people have said that's probably because she wore so much makeup and lipstick. So, what else? So the family I was staying with, as I mentioned, a middle-aged couple and three, nope, four young men and adolescent boys. Um, so, well, I remember, I can't remember if I told this. They were talking about getting baptized, and one of them said you got baptized in the Catholic school, so you could be a Catholic, and then you could get baptized in the Wesleyan school, so you can be a Wesleyan. I did tell this, but anyway. And now, Brother Harley and them are baptizing people again, and it's because they're just people are listening to other people. So that leaves the impression that they really didn't go for it, didn't feel it on a deep level. But then later, the couple they had an argument. They had a fight. And the reason was apparently the man, she had observed him flirting with one of the young, like one of the, early teen girls or something like that, which was pretty common, unlike many others of his age, and he didn't act on it, as far as I know. But still, she was mad, and she moved out for like a minute, one of those quick breakup and returns that couples sometimes have. But she said, "This must be the wickedest place in the world. because even the littlest girls want man. Um, I've been to various places where they say this is the wickedest, this is the most evil, this is the worst place in the whole world. And it's like people who say that usually haven't traveled very much, because if they had, there's wickeder places than where they happen to live, um, or at least equally wicked. But the whole concept of wickedness, and this being a wicked place because of the lustfulness of their young women, which was by no means limited to the village of Barranco. It was pretty common in Belize and, well, other places, obviously, um, that it was wicked. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. And at one point, the guy, he also had an argument with the guy next door who ran the closest thing to a shop in town. What did it sell? It sold rum, ideals, which were bags of Kool-Aid in a bag, which was great in that climate. And then he sold like little candies, little gum they called chicles, and soda pops and such. Uh, Mostly frivolous, unnecessary stuff, because they got their real food sources from the forests and the jungles and the river and the little bit of food they grew in their yards. And they bought domestic animals and butchered them, or bought parts of them from each other, and so forth and so forth. So, where am I going? Oh, yes. They got into a fight, and that guy was kind of hot-headed. I'm not sure. The guy who ran the little shop, I had some kind of argument with him myself. But anyways, the guy, the guy who lived at my place, he came back. He was like, and he's got this hot temper, and he calls himself, a man of God, and stuff like that. So I guess what I'm saying is it did penetrate for a little deeper than I may have led you to believe in the last video, which was 27. This is number 28. And another thing, speaking of that shop and its soda pops, Fanta and such, there was a little incident where the British Army, there were like Scottish soldiers that came up to the village, as well as Nepali soldiers, but they were usually here. They were just kicking back, drinking, singing, talking and such. But this time, no, they were on high alert. There was some kind of a not quite a border skirmish, because I don't think any shots were fired, but there was an incident with Guatemala where I think they were afraid that Guatemala might invade, that it might do what it had been, constantly threatening to do. So, yeah, that was a tense moment. And also, one of the soldiers, he gave a little boy some money to go to the shop and get him a cold soda, some Fanta. Obviously, he didn't have time to do it himself because they were on alert. Do I have anything else? I cannot at the moment remember anything else I have to say about Rancho. So now I will go back to the Sausolito houseboats. So yeah, I traveled back to Sausolito, and as soon as I got there, I was like, why was I such a hurry to why didn't I go to the islands off Honduras when my father offered me the chance? Why didn't I at least take a buggy tour in New Orleans when I had the chance? Why was I in such a hurry to get home? And then I'm just kind of stuck there for, well, as it turned out, not for very long, but that's how it felt to me at the time. I was getting some reverse culture shock. I remember smoking a joint with some of my teenage friends as I had, as a freshman. Yeah, I went back to high school in Marin, which on more in a bit. Of course, and I was like, oh, this weed is nothing. I've just been to Belize where the weed is much better, which was basically true, but it wasn't nothing either. I wandered around, the town, and I kind of got this anxiety because I had been used to like living in really rural areas where there were always some, beach or jungle or someplace I could retreat to if I wanted to just chill by myself. And here it seemed like everywhere I went, I was on somebody's doorstep. I was in somebody's yard, there was everything was private property. This wasn't a city. This was a suburb. And in fact, I later realized Marin County, for being I mean, not Marin, yes, Marin County, the whole county being located right next to San Francisco, actually they worked hard, and there was and there still is a lot of green space. So it wouldn't have been that hard for me to get in the woods, but it took a little more planning. But it was more population density than I was used to, and it was obviously more development and technology and so forth. But And so it seemed like there were new buildings, in Sausolito. Like Sausolito had really changed a lot since I'd been there for a year, away for a year. More so, I mean, they constructed things more quickly than they had in Belize, especially rural Belize. But it really hadn't changed that much. And the houseboat wars were going on. So I was right back in the middle of all that. And so I once again went to a waterfront protection association meeting. Now, meanwhile, I was living with my father, who was renting or subletting or something, a little houseboat of his own. But that houseboat had fleas. And after my experience with spending a night in an absolutely flea infested little shanty town in an alley in Guatemala City, Mayan shanty town, and then carrying those fleas around with me till I got back to Belize and was told how to get rid of them. So I was not in the mood to live with fleas again, because they tend to bite me. And so do mosquitoes. My father said, yeah, I saw them, but they just jumped on and jumped off. They liked my sweet blood, I guess. But where was I to go instead? So the houseboat wars, which I described previously, there was always tension that this structure or that structure, especially the ones on the border. The border So obviously it wasn't an official city or country. There was no official border. But by that I mean there was an area where it was developed, and then that would stop, and there was an area where the ground was dirt. It wasn't covered with concrete, and the houseboat community began. And so one of the guys at the meeting said he lived well, he didn't live there, but he had a trailer where he stored some of his stuff right next to the parking lot. So basically on the border between the houseboat community and the rest of Sausalito. And he said he was worried that they would come in and tow it away, maybe pave the area. So to prevent that, he wanted somebody to live in the trailer, or rather in half of the trailer, because the other half he was using to store his stuff. And I said, I'll do it, I'll do it. So I did. And it wasn't a bad setup. I lived near. By this time I had turned 16, So I was living near, but not with my father, and not very far from my mother and stepfather, who still lived up in the hills of Sausolito. Um, and there was a flea market nearby on the weekends in Marin City, which was the black poverty pocket next to our mostly white poverty pocket. Um, and so they had flea markets on Saturday and Sunday. So I went and I got some cool stuff. I got a little folding bed, and I got a little record player, and I got some records, and I got a hot plate, which I would sometimes leave on at night when I was asleep as a heater, until the guy whose trailer it was told me, please stop doing that, because he had a dream that it caught on fire. So I did. And um, I didn't have a refrigerator, but I did have an ice chest. So I would get bags of ice and put it in the ice box and get some like vegetables and stuff and what have you, which I could cook on my hot plate or eat largely as stuff I ate raw. And the ice chest would keep it a little longer than if it was just sitting out. So it wasn't such a bad situation once I started getting used to it, although I only got used to it to a certain degree. High school, I got into a program called IRS, which I don't remember what it stands for. It was kind of aimed at kids who were smart and nonconformist, and I fit the bill pretty well. Um, they didn't have like six classes, one scheduled on top of the other. Uh, the group that was in the program basically stayed together the whole time, and the teachers, there were a couple of regular teachers, and then sometimes there'd be like other teachers. They'd come in and teach the classes while we mostly stayed in one place. And it wasn't bad. But I still had undiagnosed learning disabilities. And so they put me in another program, which it turned out was basically, I would spend like one class out of the day there or something. It was the Stupid Kids program. And my mom later commented that basically they had me in the Smart Kids program and the Stupid Kids program at the same time, which really wasn't addressing the problem, which is true. And they didn't really understand learning disabilities and such very well at the time. They know about ADD or ADHD, but they didn't know about Asperger's, dyspraxia, all that stuff. And since I was articulate, once again, it wasn't obvious to anybody. So I did that. And obviously, although I kind of flirted and whenever possible touched the attractive female teacher who was in her 30s, I guess, and worked in the Stupid Kids program to the point where she felt like I didn't get enough affection at home, because like I would always do things like say, oh, that's a nice ring, and hold her onto her finger. And that may well have been true, but also it was my excuse to touch a woman. So not that mysterious, really. Maybe the other guys didn't do that, but I did. Um, so meanwhile, over in IRS, there were more smarter, more eccentric, and more interesting students. There were a couple of lesbians. I'm not sure I quite got it right away, but they dressed and acted in masculine clothing. They dressed in masculine clothing. They, you know, were kind of more, how shall I say it? More outspoken, especially when talking to guys. Not that the rest were like shrinking violets, but they had a particularly assertive way of being, and they hung out together. At some point, I must have realized these were the lesbians, and they were. And then there was the first punk rocker, maybe the first two, but mainly the first one was in the program with me. And she, I believe, had her hair dyed green. She was like 16, and she wore this thing around her neck, which was a do-it-yourself. It was like a test tube baby. I mean, it wasn't really, but that was the joke, with a little booklet, which now I realize was derivative of the pet rocks, which were popular at the time, which were like just a rock in a box with a booklet on how to care for your pet rock, and people would pay money for this thing, and it was pretty dumb, but 70s fads. But the whole thing intrigued me. Um, and I recall her writing on the chalkboard something about free Sid Vicious. And I said, well, what's this about? This was 1978. And in this point, Sid Vicious had just been arrested in New York. He wasn't in jail for long, but he wasn't alive for long after that. But he was at the time sitting in Rikers Island in New York for the crime of murdering his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen. She said that they had a suicide pact. She would commit suicide, which her theory was she had committed suicide, and then he would commit suicide, but he had not managed to finish his end of it. And therefore, he should be set free. Now, a little bit of a tangent. Not long later, I wound up briefly living with the girlfriend of Sid Vicious after the one that he allegedly murdered. And I also had a friend who had let him stay at her place and scored heroin for him, and then got help from him when he OD'd, presumably on the heroin she had scored for him. Um, so yeah, I wasn't very many realms. Pretty soon, when I moved to San Francisco, I was not very many realms, and many degrees. I was like 1 degree of separation from Sid Vicious himself. Um, Now, I studied later, of course, I've gone back and studied the whole situation more, seen movies, like, and so forth. My general impression is that the night when Nancy Spungen was killed, um, there were people in and out of the house all night. And there were a lot of drugs used, many of them like narcotics and sedatives and basically downers. Um, and yeah, and also she could be very belligerent and pee people off. Even his mom was late. Sid Vicious, no, sorry, Nancy Spungen mom was interviewed and said, "Yeah, I could see," and she wasn't hostile to Sid. She didn't seem to have any anger towards him and remembered him as just kind of this sad young guy. Um, but she said, I could really see my daughter goading him into stabbing her. I'm not saying this justifies it. But the thing is, nobody really knows if he did it or not. And I would not at all be surprised if he was in so much of a blackout that he himself did not know if he did it or not. But there's a whole tangle of pathologies here, which I later realized I thought were cool at one time, but later realized were part of a general syndrome. His mother was a heroin addict, and he used amphetamines and alcohol quite a bit when he was very young. Well, pretty young anyway, in his teens. And I mean, he was drinking way too much for a guy in his teens. And his mom gave him heroin and a needle for his birthday once. And then but he wasn't real. Apparently, from what I've heard and read, he wasn't really violent. He was a nice guy, a meek guy, you know. But then he got caught up in the whole punk thing where they called him Sid Vicious, which was actually a name for their hamster, uh, a pet hamster of somebody who had bitten them when they were petting it. And so they called it Sid Vicious, and then they called him Sid Vicious. And so the trouble is, he wasn't that bright, and he bought into the myth, and he became violent, really seriously did harm to people. And then there's this whole syndrome of alcoholism, drug addiction, self mutilation, violence, domestic violence. Um, and it was all glorified and glamorized, and there's nothing glamorous about it, and it's not really that unusual. And so Nancy, on the other hand, was also an awful person who did goad people, who was verbally abusive to him, and made a lot of people very angry. Allegedly, she turned him on to heroin, but when I found out that his mom was using heroin, I was like, okay, come on, we can't blame, and actually gave him heroin on one occasion. We can't really, on at least one occasion, and that they would, she would shoot heroin and he would shoot speed, and they'd hang out together. I don't think you can blame Nancy for that one. But they were both awful people. That's my point. They were terrible people. They were sad, mentally twisted people. That's what I eventually realized. And he died at 21, and I don't know how old she was, a little older probably. So, but that's neither here nor there. I was in I'm still in San Francisco. So anyway, I talked to this young woman, this girl, about punk rock and what it was all about. And she told me that you could go to the punk clubs. And so I realized, no, not a club that you join, but a nightclub that you go to. And so I did. I went. Still living in Sausolito, taking, long commutes, doing, new and different drugs. um, having various adventures, um, and starting to dress in my own very lame version of punk rock. And so they were all like, yeah, okay, he's a convert to your thing. Um, so now there were three of us in the high school. So the main place, well, there were two. There was the Mabuhay Gardens, which is the one that most people know about, if they know about that scene at all, if they weren't there. Um, and it was a Filipino restaurant by day and a punk club by night. And yeah, there was this guy Dirk Dirksen who would goad the audience, and the audience loved being goaded and yelling insults back and stuff. And he he knew that punks like to throw things, so apparently intentionally he gave them all. Every table had these balsa wood bowls of oversalted popcorn, and he would throw them at the stage. I mean, people would throw them. People would throw this popcorn in these bowls at the stage, and nobody got hurt. And that was pretty clever, actually. Um, and then the other place was was called the Temple Beautiful. I think it had been a synagogue once. I don't know if it was or was right next to, I think right next, very close to where Jim Jones had his temple complex just before they all fled to Guyana, which I guess had happened. As I mentioned, I once met a diehard People's Temple member. But they were off the radar for a minute until they got back onto the radar in a big way by committing mass suicide. But that hadn't happened yet. And it was located near the Fillmore, and so it was located near a lot of poor Black people. Um, yeah, and it was a culture clash, and it's likewise when they had a club in the Mission and there were these young Mexican Americans. Culture clash for sure. And the thing is that punks like to dress tough and wear leather and spikes and pins and all that sort of thing. But most of them, with a couple of exceptions, most of them didn't and really couldn't fight much or very well. And that was quickly picked up on by the other young folks in pretty much wherever we went. And we got picked on a lot. In a way, getting picked on in school, getting bullied at school, that was a source of shame for me. But when I got like assaulted by real urban street gangs and came to school with like a black eye or something, that was a source of pride to me. And it got me respect both at school and within the punk community. Like these were badges of honor. And punks did get beat up a lot in those days when it was all new. And yeah, so they had their hair dyed colors that hair doesn't normally occur on humans in the course of nature, such as green and blue and purple. Now you see that all the time, old people have it, you know, everybody, middle-aged people of different races, as so on and so forth. Not back then. It was shocking. It was new. Like, this was only like 10 years past the hippie scene, which of course was my early childhood and seemed like ancient times to me and to others in my cohort. But yeah, it shocked people. Like, we had one up the weirdness of the hippies, which was our goal, really. It's like we imitated our parents by rebelling against our parents, just as they had done. And it really was kind of like that, paradoxically. So, what kind of adventures did I have at the Temple Beautiful? Well, I was still living in Sausalito and taking the Golden Gate Ferry. Of course, a lot of them involved drugs. You'll be very surprised to know. One time, I was high on a hit of disco acid, low dose acid, or called disco acid at the time, and so I took that, and then somebody said if I wanted to buy some psychic energizer, which I knew to be a type of amphetamine in the same category as Ritalin, which I had already had a fair amount of experience with. So I said, sure. And he dumped this brown powder. Like, I gave him some money and he dumped this little handful of brown powder in my palm. And I just licked it off. And when I took the bus home, I was still like licking this stuff off my finger. Um, on another occasion, a young, right, the exception at that time to us not getting along, punks not getting along with Mexican Americans, was the Zeros, who were a punk band and also were Mexican Americans. So they did a song called Everyone's a Bigot. And, it's like this group is these people, white people are bigots and black people are bigots and Filipinos are bigots and everyone's a bigot. Being at this crossroads of two groups that didn't get along, I can see how they might have felt like they were discriminated against on all sides, and thus have wrote that song. But I didn't know who he was. Tony Zero. He came up. I had taken a barbiturate, and he said, "Hey, you want to try to hit on some girls together?" Um, it's old. When two guys go out hitting on girls together, it often is more effective than if each one goes on their own, because well, the girls think at least he has a friend, and if he has a friend, at least he must be human. I actually read that somewhere. So that was probably his thinking. And I said, oh, I don't know, because I was tired from the barbiturate. He thought for a while that I was gay, but I wasn't. Um, but I was sleepy. And at some point, I fell asleep on the floor while the band was playing. And so then he said, oh, you were all effed up. Um, on another occasion, okay, those were two separate occasions. On another occasion, I had bought a joint laced with PCP, which I had never done before. And so then I was talking to these two girls, and I said, hey, I have a joint you can smoke with me if you want, but but just so you know, it's laced with PCP. And they said, sure, let's get effed up. And it was them and another guy who I would later become friends with. Let me just call him Mark M. Mark M. So anyway, So I'm glad that I didn't try to smoke it myself, and it was shared between the four of us because it was really, really strong, and I got that experience, which I've heard is common with PCP, of feeling like my brain was not contained within my body. It just went on and on and on and on and on outside my body, outside into the universe. And some guy said, "Do you know what band is up next?" And I said, "I don't even know what planet I'm on." And he said, "Yeah, I hear you, you know." But after a while, I came down a bit. So it was the four of us. We were still high, but we were like, at least we were, basically back in our bodies. So we got together and we started making out, all four of us, open mouth kissing each other. Yeah, I'd never done that with a man before, and but I was doing it with two women and a man, so it was all fun. It was all good, especially because I was loaded as hell, and these women were going to take me home with them, and I was like, yeah, cool. But unfortunately, one of them had a broken arm, and I banged it in a. I closed a door on her broken arm, and by now we'd come down a little bit, so she actually was capable of feeling pain, which I had accidentally caused her. And so she said, "I don't know if I want to go home with you anymore." And they didn't. So I was on my own again, and I think I got some alcohol, and then I managed to make it safely home. So that was another night. I I think I had safety pinned legs onto my shirt as an attempt to look punk, which I later realized was not the look that most of them were going for. And there were these teenage girls who routinely sat on the stairs and were mean. They were mean to me and to other people, including other girls, I later heard. For example, they had one teenage girl, they found out she was on acid and they messed with her, messed with her mind on purpose. And they said to me, and I may have been high too. One of them said he read too many comic books when he was young, which I had read a lot of comic books when I was younger. And I don't know if she knew me from Sausolito from when I had actually been a child. She may have. I thought she had, but that may have been a really not particularly lucky guess because a lot of boy children read a lot of comic books. Um, and then one time I met a guy who was selling uppers, amphetamine pills. So I got one, and the guy turned out to be, well, he later became a pretty big level, a fairly big level drug dealer who sold, heroin and meth, which he also used. But he also became more famous as the member of a band. They were with a different band at the time, but well, he was, and later they formed a band known as Flipper, and that band became famous and still remain famous. Uh, I remember decades later, I was talking to some young guy at a party, some young punk guy, and he was like, and I said, "Oh yeah, I was into that scene way early." And he said, did you see this band? Did you see the Dead Kennedys? Yes. Did you see Flipper? I was like, "Oh, yeah, I saw them a million times. In fact, I used to hang out with them. I bought drugs from one of them, on a regular basis." And he was so impressed. He was like, "That guy's seen every punk show in San Francisco. She's seen every punk show ever." And I was like, "Well, not exactly. I saw many of the punk shows that were in San Francisco between about 1978 and 1981. And the early 80s was when Flipper was really kind of dominating the punk, going into post-punk and then going into extinction scene." So that happened. And then another time I was out in front of the Temple Beautiful. So there were a couple of one or two Rastafarian black guys working there. So it wasn't like it was 100% white, but it was mostly white, to be fair. And so I guess some of the young black guys in the neighborhood took a dislike to us. Um, to be fair, we were pretty obnoxious. I was, and many of the others were, but there was also a lot of general racial tension at the time, and not that that's gone away. And so they started beating people up, and I was just watching them like, geez, I wish I could help them, but I have a feeling I can't, but I feel like I should. And then one of them just punched me in the eye, which broke me out of my trance, and I walked across the street to catch the bus. And fortunately, they did not pursue me because they were too distracted by beating the tar out of some of the other guys that they had surrounded. And so I was waiting for the bus, and it took a while. And this one guy said, so you go out and you see a good show, which is good. This was a black guy, by the way, cool guy, and he said, which is good, but then your mood is ruined by having to wait for the bus so long. It was dark, and I don't know if my eye had totally turned colors yet. He obviously didn't notice. And of course, I didn't say anything, but I was thinking, you know what? My mood has already been ruined before that. So, yeah. So let's talk about some other things that I did at that time. Um, there was this one girl in the IRS program, maybe a year younger than me, that I kind of liked. Um, and she went by the name of Midnight, which I think I can say because I doubt she goes by that name anymore, wherever she is. And she was a singer in a band too. And one night I took maybe a half hit of a disco acid on Halloween and went to see her. They did, and okay, she wasn't a terribly good singer, really. And I remember a couple walked in and took a look. But she was 15, you know. What can you expect? She wasn't a prodigy anyway, but they took a look and just walked back out. And I was tripping on the black and orangeness of everything, which later I realized are just normal Halloween colors, nothing unusual about that. And then I got a ride home, or somehow I got a ride, and I went back to the trailer I was living in, and I was still high. So I picked up a copy of Plato. Um, So, yeah, I guess I was a reasonably smart kid. I was buzzed on acid and decided I would read some Plato. Um, and I remember reading stuff like, if a thing is a half of another thing, no way. He said, if a thing is bigger than another thing, that is because it has more bigness in it. And the other guy said, oh, yes, of course. And then he said, and if a thing is a half of another thing, it's because it has more halfness in it. And the other guy said, oh, yes, nobody can answer with that, can debate that. And I'm like, what the F? Like, of course they can debate that. Like, that's ridiculous. This guy is held up as like one of the great philosophers of Western civilization. Like, he doesn't make any sense. And I still feel that way about the whole doctrine of the forms and how, like, every bird has birdness in it and everything beautiful has beautiness, and there's a realm where there's just pure beautiness and pure birdness and pure bigness and pure halfness. I'm like, absolutely absurd. Some people like it, not me. I was also reading a book I was reading Gandhi's biography. Okay, anyway, back to the more interesting to most of you topic. So I brought Midnight over to my I brought her over to my trailer to buy speed. So I connected with my regular dealer, who I later realized was selling me crap speed cut with something, which may have been just as well because that made it kind of weaker. Um, and then he was this, like, how should I describe it? It's like when a guy has been doing speed for a while, or a woman, like, no matter how old they are, and even if their hair is not turning white, they seem old and tired and scruffy and just not unappealing. So he bought us the speed, and then he said to Midnight, "Can I kiss you?" So she kissed him on the lips, and then we went into my trailer, and I considered asking her the same thing, which maybe I should have, but it kind of felt weird to just ask her right after she had just asked. The whole thing felt weird, and I said something to the effect of, you don't want to do too much speed because otherwise you'll wind up, like a speed freak and like that guy. And she said, yeah, and he reeks. So he smelled, and she wasn't actually attracted to him, which means that I could have gone a bit further, I bet. But maybe I would have wanted her to rinse her lips off first, because I wouldn't have wanted to catch whatever the hell he had on his old speed freak lips. Yeah, the difference between some of the people in the houseboats and some of the people in the punk scene, as the punk scene progressed into more and more of a hard drug scene, was, I later realized, kind of more superficial than really entirely different. I mean, drugs create their own personality types regardless of what kind of personalities the people have to begin with. But I didn't know that. Uh, and and then at some point, her father, she went back to where she was from, with to Mendocino, and I had been to Mendocino before and slept with some drug addicts in an abandoned water tower full of clothing. That was when I had been a youth of 14, but now I was 16, and I made this rather silly decision to get on the bus with her, which she was fine with. And then I went to her parents' place, and I had some meth with me, and I gave her some. And then I met her father, and he was like, "Yeah, you can't stay here anymore. Bye bye." And so then I went back to Mendocino and hoped I would find, that whole scene with the water tower again, but it was gone. So I went back. A bit of a flop that trip, but whatever. And what else? Oh, yes, the tribal stomp. Somebody tried to, somebody organized was it 2 days, 3 days music festival. And the intention was it was supposed to be a meeting of the tribes, meaning he had many musicians from many different genres of music that were big at the time. And so there was Country Joe, who was an old 60s, not that old, but seemed old at the time, 60s protest singer. And there was The Clash, which of course is a punk band, which I was glad to see. Peter Tosh was there. He's reggae from Jamaica. And there were a bunch of other bands that I don't particularly remember. And then there was the one that everybody I knew, including an acid dealer I knew from Sausolito, he liked them, and there were these two guys that I was hanging out with. They liked, not them, they liked her. This was Big Mama Thornton, the legendary blues singer, the one who had wrote the original she didn't write it, but she did sing the original version of You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog, which was much better than, in my opinion, the Elvis Presley version, and it made a lot more sense because she said, "You ain't nothing but a hound dog hanging around my door, and I don't want to see you anymore," which she was talking about an ex-lover that was trying to come back, obviously. And it makes a whole lot more sense than "You ain't nothing but a hound dog crying all the time. You never caught a rat." What the heck? But he was young and white and good looking and had enough of a black sound that he became Elvis Presley, enormously famous, of course. So, but at any rate, we were all like, Big Mama Thornton is really good. We were tripping on some disco acid as well. I think, I was on drugs the whole weekend, and I hung out with these two guys, and they bought some, this disco acid from some there was a little clique of gay men that went by name that were there that went by names like Tinkerbell that these guys knew. And obviously they were kind of, what do you say, fairies, somewhat flamboyant, somewhat, the type. Anyway, or maybe you don't. Maybe that was just a 70s type. I don't know. At any rate, we took it, and I smoked some honey oil, which turned out to be just another name for hash oil. I thought they were two different things, and smoked weed, and then I may have done a little low-grade meth, and no, I don't think I did any speed at that particular time. Um, I know that part of the time when I was tripping, and after I'd seen The Clash, and I was like trying to figure out like what I was I a hippie? Was I a punk? If I was a punk, I should be violent or something. So I like put a safety pin through a rose, and I kicked some things around. I didn't really hurt anybody or anything. I was just experimenting with being violent without real consequences, which is good. I'm glad I didn't, do it out for real. One of the guys I was with though did say, "You're acting kind of violent." Um, and I guess at some point I sniffed part of a Black Beauty, which was considered a rather crude drug for the time, but it had benzodrine and dexedrine. That's why it was called Bi. It had two different, and it was considered like the crudest and most useless kind of speed available, teeth gritting and everything, which was ironic because those same ingredients that later and still became known as Adderall, which I recently tried as ADD medication and decided after a while to quit. So I did a little bit of that. And then Wavy Gravy, he came up on the scene. Wavy Gravy, who is an activist with a clown persona, with a stoner clown persona. And he really seemed like an idiot to me. Not just that time. Every time I've seen him, he seemed kind of idiotic and drug damaged, to be honest. He said something, and he was in clown makeup, and he said, "Okay, this is called the funny mantra," and he made a raspberry, and I'm like, that's not that funny. I told it to someone else later, and she said, "That's not that funny," and I said, "I know." But I got to give him credit where credit is due, if indeed credit is due. He got a hold of a sack of like homegrown weed, and I already had like a baggie with weed in it, but people were just going on stage and having a handful of this homegrown, and I did it too and put it in the baggie, and we were smoking that. And then the first night we spent we camped out in sleeping bags, and we were camped right near some people who seemed to be high on a combination of acid and booze, and were actually pretty obnoxious. And they were talking nonsense, kind of mean nonsense, actually, all night. One guy was like, "And my grandfather could do 10 push-ups and 10 pull-ups when he was old," and the other guy was like, "Get to the point." And then they accused him of being gay, and he said, "I'm not gay. I like to have girls sit on my face and wiggle, especially if they're between the ages about 16 and 19." And the other guy said, "You're a fag and you know it." And now in retrospect, I'm like, no, he was probably straight. But the thing that he did like to do, which was be sexual with underage or illegal, well, barely legal to illegal girls, would be far more frowned upon nowadays, at least around here, more than being gay. And he would. It's ironic that he would use that as his cover story. Um, and at some point, some guy was yelling that his nose had been broken and blah blah. So we got some sleep, but not all that much sleep. So then Um, there were Peter Todd, there was Rastafarians around. And I was tripping. I don't know if I'd trip. Maybe the day before I'd done my speed and my low grade meth and my amphetamine, but and then the next day I did my acid and honey. I'm not really sure. What am I, Hunter S. Thompson? Does anybody care exactly what drugs I took? But in 1978, but still, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So the next night it was the three of us chilling, and we were high on acid, among other, and weed. And some guy said, "Oh, you can crash with me." And so we went over to his place, and we were still pretty wired. He was wired too because he had just done some coke, he said, and he had this bottle of wine, and one of the guys would like, let's be winos. Let's just be winos and pass the bottle around. And he said, you have to drink one glass one glass of it out of a glass out of respect for the guy who spent his whole life creating this kind of wine. And we went, all right. And then we drank, I guess we drank a glass. And then we were like, let's be winos. Let's be winos. And so, and we smoked more homegrown. And then, well, the bottom line is that he was another one of those predatory type of gay men, aka chicken hawks, that I met from time to time, really actually fairly often during that period. And it was weird. Okay, first of all, one of the guys was kind of ugly, so I don't think he got hit on. Ironically, although he was not admitting it at the time. In fact, he said, I want to see some girls in halter tops with big titties. But he said all that in a kind of what they call gay accent. Later, it turned out he actually was gay, but he was the one guy that this other guy, this chicken hawk, did not hit on, because me and the other guy, the second guy, were kind of cute, and the third guy really wasn't. So he came over to me in a bathrobe. Like, the three of us were sleeping. One of them wasn't really sleeping. He was so spun. He was like, I dropped my ID in the toilet. I dropped my ID in the toilet. But finally, like, things started to chill down a little. By the way, I had a copy of Punk magazine. That was the hilarious, iconic magazine that Legs McNeil put out in New York City, and it was a combination of cartoons, writings. Most of it was pretty silly, actually. And then there was a drawing of some, famous punk star of the time. So I got it, I had it, and I made use of it. Because when this guy came over to where I was lying down with this bathrobe, he changed into a bathrobe. He wasn't, wearing it before, and it was like partially open. I could see his chest hairs. And by this time, I was pretty hip to that kind of thing. So I caught on pretty quickly. And in order to repel this guy, I started picking up Well, I had been picking up and reading this magazine, which was very bizarre to read while you were on acid. There was this comic strip about Idi Amin, and he was going along everywhere he went. There were like skulls and severed heads and human bones, and then at the end he said, "Mommy, why doesn't anybody like me?" But so I've been reading that, and then he came along, and then I started reading parts of it out loud, and I said, what was it? Something out of the magazine that was like shit on um what was his name? Uh he was a boy band kind of guy. Something Patrick or Sean Cassidy. Anyway, like shit on Sean Cassidy, and the other guy said shit on it on his face, and the other guy said shit on it, sit on it. In other words, trying to resexualize, turn the situation sexual again, but I wasn't having it. And then I said, you know, there's no such thing as different days if you don't sleep in between. Tonight and tomorrow, today and tonight and tomorrow are all the same day if you don't sleep. And it was one of those things that seems really profound when you're on acid, but isn't. And and one of the other guys with me said, "Mellow out," which probably meant it was not what I said, it was how I said it, which was this intense way because I was trying to deflect this guy's attention, which ultimately did work. I without having to directly put him off, I managed to create a somewhat hostile and unerotic uh, environment. And he had hit on the other guy. Later, we talked the morning, and I said, "Oh God, that guy was hitting on me." I was like, "I know he was hitting on me too," but he had discreetly done it to each of us because he didn't want all three of us to realize at the same time. Because, well, there were three of us and one of him, and you never know. And then at one point I said, "Oh, I tried amyl nitrate. I like that drug." I had tried it when I was 14 in high school. He said, "I've got some amyl nitrate." And then, "Oh, you do?" He said, "Yeah." And he took it out of the refrigerator, and I took a hit, and I didn't enjoy it. This time I didn't enjoy it. Like my heart started pounding, and it was kind of, I was already tripping. It was like being in some kind of like strobe light, but not in a good way. And like it gave me a headache afterward. But I stole it from him the next day anyway. And um and so it wasn't amyl nitrate. It was butyl nitrate, which is legal, which is crap, which I never liked. It was nasty, ugly, fake, trying to be, it was an amyl nitrate wannabe, but I still took it with me. And then the next day, I think the one guy who'd like lost his ID in the toilet probably took more acid than the rest of us because he was like still tripping. And it's like, we had Greyhound tickets. But wait, before I get to that. So we left, and he said, well, one of the guys stole some change out of his, apparently he had like $5, and the guy took part of it in bills. He didn't take it all. He took some of it. And then I scooped a bunch of change into and put it in my pockets along with the butyl. And then he said something to the effect of, "I've got some whites, but could you save me a couple?" And I said, "But there's only three." And there were three of us. And he said, "Okay." So I took the three. They were cross tops, which were these little teeny and not very strong little Benzedrine pills, and the other guys didn't want any, which I was like, cool, that means I get all three of them. And then, like I said, the guy was probably tripping harder than the rest of us because it was already like it was the next day by this time. And we had already purchased Greyhound tickets, and it was like, I want to hitchhike. I want to hitchhike home. Let's hitchhike back. And the other guy was like, we're not going to hitchhike when we already have bus tickets. That's absurd. And I think it would have taken three young guys together. It would have taken us a while to get a ride, or it would have been with another predatory type of guy. So we took the bus. We took the bus, and I took a couple of crosstalks along the way, and then I got back to Sausolito, and I had one left. I crushed it and sniffed it, and then I went to the shower house and took a shower. You know what? This all may have happened after I got back from Japan, but it doesn't matter. It was approximately the same time frame. Well, anyway, it was before I moved to San Francisco permanently. Yeah, a lot of this stuff was. So I took another hit off of the butyl nitrate. I looked at it and realized it was butyl, which didn't know about. And I took another hit, and again, I didn't like it. So I closed the bottle and tossed it into the bay. And the next week, I went to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which was also a big thing at the time. And those same two guys were there. And I had that baggie with a bunch of that homegrown left over. And I didn't know how to roll it. So I told them that, and they said, one of the guys said, oh, I'll go. The same guy who dropped his ID in the toilet. He said, oh, I'll take it and roll some up. And he did, but he came back and he said, I'm sorry, I dropped some of it in the toilet. Now, granted, he had just dropped something important in the toilet the previous time I'd been with him, so it was possible. But I think it's more likely that he pinched it, i.e., he stole some of it for himself. But whatevs. There was some left, and there was some rolled joints, so we chilled. The other guy said, "Do you still have that butyl, that poppers?" I said, "No, I don't. I'd thrown it away because it was yucky." So I saw the Rocky Horror Picture Show for the first time. This was like 1978, and I liked it. Who doesn't like it? And it had already the whole thing with people throwing things at the stage and stuff. And it was at the Strand, which was this really cool neighborhood, downtown San Francisco, underground-ish theater. I'll talk more about that later because it became important. But it was at 7th and Market. So when I moved to San Francisco and I walked by the Strand, I'm like, wow, I'm living right in the middle of everything. That's how it felt. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So the bottom line is I was somewhat punkified, just enough to make me awkward everywhere I went. Awkward in the suburbs, awkward at school, awkward among real punks, But I was having fun. And the thing is that I had felt so alienated coming back from Belize. I felt reverse culture shock. I felt weird. I felt like society was over technological. Little did I know how technological it would become. Although, of course, I wrote science fiction, and I predicted the body modification movement. By the way, I predicted something like it in one of my stories, but we're not there yet. So, so the bottom line is, when I found out about punk, I liked it because the alienation in punk matched the alienation that I was feeling. Now I feel different. I kind of feel like the years 1976 through 1980 were like a golden age. At that time, I thought, well, just prior to that, I had thought that the 60s was the golden age, the late 60s, but I had missed out because although I had been there, I had been there as a little child, so I missed that party and had been really bummed about it. Now I was like, hey, we have our own way to reject and hate society. But be that as it may, it was kind of a golden age in a way, at least in San Francisco for teenagers. First of all, um, the Vietnam War was over. There were some freaked out Vietnam vets hitting the streets and houseboats already. But no one was getting drafted, so that was out of the way. And Nixon wasn't in power. It was first Ford, who was benign, and then who hadn't been elected, served for like a year, and then Carter, who was benign. I think he tried to do good, and well, I think the media kind of undercut him a lot when the ambassadors in Iran, again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but when the ambassadors in Iran got kidnapped and held hostage for a long time, like every day the news would say, well, today is day 83 of the hostage crisis. And I'm like, it's not news every single day if nothing has changed. I thought in retrospect, like they were really undercutting him because it wasn't that easy a problem to solve. And so I kind of think like I'd rather have a weak president like Carter who tried to do good and failed than a strong, allegedly strong president like Reagan who would follow, who tried to do good and who tried to do bad and succeeded, like really succeeded. Not on his own, but with help, he screwed things up. So that's why I'm saying in 1981, the golden age ended. Reagan got elected. Herpes got into public consciousness, and then AIDS arrived, and the country was getting more conservative, and on and on. It truly was an end of an era that I did not appreciate when I was in it. I didn't appreciate the fact that I could go to clubs and buy drinks at 16, or that I could go to the liquor store. And I'm not saying these are good things, but that I could go to a liquor store and buy alcohol at 16, and I could sleep with grown women, not only in Belize, but also in the USA. Um, and that wasn't considered a big thing. Age of consent laws were not taken all that seriously back then. So, gay men would hit on boys, and straight men would hit on girls, and just general predatory chicken hawks would hit on both. And older women or at least grown adult women would hit on and or date teenage under 18 boys, and people just didn't think that much of it back then. Very different from now. Anyway, I had a lot of liberty to live, but I also was in kind of a, well, this happened more when I left Japan and my parents weren't around anymore. I was in a, like, I was having a lot of fun, but at the same time, I was really scared and directionless and anxious. So it was a mixed bag. And, my parents were pretty neglectful, to be honest, in retrospect, or some not in retrospect, were just straight up. I got $50 a month from my father and $50 a month from my mother and stepfather. And even then, that was not enough to live on. Anyway, I stayed in Sausolito in the trailer. Awkward. Until my parents invited me to live with my mother and stepfather had moved to an army base in Japan. So this is when I reunited with my mother and stepfather and younger brother, who was 7 at the time, and and so I lived a semester on an army base in Japan. That was another epic. And well, just to give you a prelogue, it's like when I got to Japan, it was like Belize. When I'd gotten back to the US from Belize, I was like, wow, everything's so technological, everything's crowded together, and there's so much machinery everywhere, and there's so much not, there's so much technology everywhere. And then, well, when I came back from Japan, I was like, wow, there's so much open space everywhere, because really there was. And when I got to Japan, it was like even more technological. Like there were video games before, like we only had Pong, and the Japanese already had Space Invaders, and mostly it was Space Invaders, but anyway, they were developing arcade games quicker than we were, or at least generating them to the general public, and all the doors were automatic. And I was like, okay, I went from the past to the present to the future in a very short period of time. Like I'd been in a time machine. Like, okay, back to the past. Okay, back to the present. Okay, back to the future. And then back to the past. And of course, Japan wasn't like our future, but my stepfather said it was like a mix of the 1850s, the 1950s, and the 2050s. So I liked Japan, and I didn't like living on the army base and going to high school there so much, which is odd considering my personality, that it wouldn't mix well with a military environment. But that is all. I think it's already almost an hour and a half, and I should end it now. Bye-bye.